Hello, everyone. Welcome to Feedstuffs 365. I'm Sarah Muirhead. The Mississippi River Ship Canal is an important gateway supporting global trade for the U.S. while serving domestic markets. The key to it being a vital gateway is the supporting infrastructure that allows for deep draft vessels and shallow draft non-self-propelled inland barge equipment to access ports and terminals along the river channel. Joining us today to talk about a recently completed study on the trade impact and economic benefits and risks from disruption in the channel are Sean Duffy of the Big River Coalition and Ken Eriksen of Polaris Analytics and Consulting. Welcome to you both here today.
Good afternoon, Sarah.
Before we get started, we'd like to invite anyone that's tuning in. If you have any questions for our guests, please post those there in the chat area on your screen. If you're joining us from social media, you can post those directly in your social feed. Thank you so much. All right, Sean, let's start by having you give us an overview of the Big River Coalition and your role with the BRC. Sean, can you talk to us about the Big River Coalition? All right, Ken, can you give us a little bit about Polaris Analytics and Consulting? Let's start there.
Yeah, thank you much. And it's a joy that we're working remotely and from our own vehicles in different places around the world. But Sarah, it's a pleasure to be with you again. And Polaris Analytics and Consulting is a consulting firm and working with people on the data side, on analytics, taking this mountain of data, the ocean of data, if you will, and transforming it into a knowledge set to help people make strategic decisions in their business. And the consulting, I work with people in the commodity supply chains, largely with agriculture, but also in energy and biofuels, renewables, and working all the way through, let's say from farm gate through to the world, whether it's to the dinner plate or to a fuel position, and really with the idea of looking at transportation as that vehicle that's so important, and to be able to work with a number of different clients, both here in the United States and quite frankly, around the world.
Sean, can you hear us now? I don't think we have Sean with us. So, Ken, maybe you can give us an overview of the Big River Coalition. I know you've worked with them recently here on this study. What are they all about?
Yeah, the Big River Coalition president and CEO is Sean Duffy out of New Orleans, Louisiana, but really works in an advocacy role in one hand with the shippers and the ship pilots and the agencies to assure that the river is going to be navigable, that it's going to have the proper draft and the proper access, and that it remains open. But he also works in advocacy with legislatures and decision makers and elected officials and explaining the value and importance of this Mississippi River ship channel from Baton Rouge out to the Gulf of America, but quite frankly, the connection upriver of the greater Mississippi River Basin, and understanding that there's an importance to be able to keep the system open, not just for closures, but even high water and draft restrictions, but really helping people see the value of the system and that the importance to the U.S. economy and quite frankly to the rest of the world. And Sean plays a pivotal role in that. Sean, are you able to hear us yet?
Apparently I think that's a no, Ken. So I think you briefly mentioned it, but just to kind of set the stage for us, when you talk about the Mississippi River Ship Channel, what specific area are you talking about? And then why is this so important to global trade?
Yeah, and that Mississippi River Ship Channel starts in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, right there where the shallow draft barges meet with the deep draft vessels. And quite frankly, that's where you almost have the largest of vessels that can access the United States comes up to just about Baton Rouge. They almost have like a 50-foot draft capability, almost to that point. But then they go all the way past New Orleans, downriver, past St. Bernard, all the way past Myrtle Grove, and then out to the Gulf of America. And it allows not only for ships to come in, and whether it's dry bulk, liquid bulk, containers, special cargo vessels, tanker vessels, all types, even cruise vessels that access that river channel. And there's probably no busier navigation waterway in the United States than that stretch. And it's a very important one. It's an economic powerhouse, and really, it's America's commodity waterway. And it's an important stretch that you connect that upper river of all that Mississippi River basin together with that deep water, and brings the world together in one spot.
Yeah, so it brings it all together, like you say, in one area, which is yeah, definitely part of that whole process. So you just completed a study, and Polaris looked at kind of that whole economic picture around the channel, and I think you worked with BRC and the Louisiana Department of Transportation and Development with that study. Give us some idea on what the real purpose is, what it is you were looking to accomplish.
Yeah, and just real quick, Sean, are you able to hear us? And
see if we can. I can. I just got on where I can hear. I re-entered and I can hear now. So
very good. All right, we'll come to you, Ken, Sean, in a minute. And Ken, give us an overview on the study, and then we'll talk to Sean.
Yeah. There's an importance here, and Sean does a great job of describing this. But be able to work with a coalition of participants and stakeholders to look at what is that economic benefit and what's the economic impact if there's disruptions. And I might be best to turn it over to Sean to describe some of these partners that worked with him and why this study was important to Big River Coalition and his membership, and to look at this. And if you don't mind, sir, I'm going to turn that over to Sean. If Sean, you can address that and value of this study.
Very good.
Yes. Thanks, Ken. For years, we deal with dredge restrictions where when a dredge is working in a certain location, we may have to stop ship traffic, maybe to put a pipeline under the channel, or because of proximity to the channel. Some of the coastal restoration work that has been ongoing has indeed called for closures of the channel. And we are hearing that the dredge project will cost $10 million more, but there's no concern about the amount of the impact on the traffic and the loss of commerce and slowing things down. Other things that we have issues with are revetment issues with the Corps when they're laying revetment mat. It's very common for us to be shut down for working hours, the daylight hours, and then to move commerce. But having reliable economic data was very important. And this had been on the Big River Coalition wish list for a very, very long time. And as the kind of opportunity came with the support from the Louisiana Department of Transportation and Development, and then to work with Ken and providing this, we were able to get some very conservative numbers that are based on standards that I'll let Ken delve into a little more. But just really looking at when we go to Congress, we're asking for funding for dredging, and to be able to say, every 24 hours, $270 million worth of cargo moves through this channel. Is very helpful when we're seeking a much smaller number for a project. It's about being able to keep commerce moving, about reliability, about having a number that we can say, so if you shut us down for 12 hours, this is how much traffic is being delayed. The value of that cargo alone is huge. And because of this data, we have real numbers now.
So you didn't have those numbers before, Sean. This is a study that helped you, or is this a study that helped you update the numbers? Has this existed in the past?
It really hadn't. There's some different studies done on the river. The Big River Coalition was part of one that was done about 15 years ago, but that was done to try to highlight the importance of commerce on the river related to the river deepening project and its infancy, the project that deepened the river from 45 to 50 feet. That economic data, of course, 15 years later is just not it's not accurate, and it's not up to date. And so this was a way to get, and I will say carefully that in that study, some of the information comes back to the economists who did it would use things like based on his opinion, and we wanted to remove that. We wanted to be on solid ground. We wanted to have verifiable numbers, a kind of lesson learned, and we went into a great deal of detail with Ken to get that data where it's solid ground. There's very little, I'll say, interpolation. It's fact based on cargo value. We were able to get a lot of data from one of the vessel agents that gave real cargo value numbers to be plugged in, and then Ken, of course, has I'll say exhaustive sources on data for different cargoes as well, and to plug that in. So this report was very exciting. It's very good. As we start to head up to Washington, these numbers will be used in our discussions about the value to commerce of keeping the ship channel moving. And then I say ship channel because that's where we're mainly focused, but hampering the shallow draft traffic delays the ship traffic too. It's a system, and we look at the entire system.
Ken, give us some general numbers on what we're talking about when it comes to the trade impact. What is the economic impact of the shipping channel?
Yeah, if you think about the amount of trade that comes in here, look, there's 5 major ports, deep water ports on that ship channel, and you put them combined, and all the volume of traffic, that waterborne traffic that goes through them, whether it comes in as an import, goes out as an export, or it's even a domestic cargo that comes in by barge or goes out by barge. You look at that volume, it's just under 500 million tons a year. And compared to any other waterway in the United States, any other port system in the United States, that's more than double the next highest waterway. And that's an important part because it's connecting that reach all the way up to Pittsburgh, to Minneapolis, St. Paul, Chicago, Kansas City, Omaha, Memphis, Little Rock, Tulsa. It's reaching very deep into the United States and covering a large area. On an everyday basis, you're looking at $273 million in trade entering what we isolated as the key ports and the key terminals there, breaking it out from the customs district there. 273 million every single day. That's 104 million of imports. It's 180, almost 190 million in exports every single day going on. And on an annual basis, that's about $100 billion in trade. And that says nothing to the domestic value that's going on, whether it's energy coming down the Mississippi River system to go in for energy needs in the area, say ethanol or renewable or biodiesel, or it could be such things as fertilizer coming out of there from some of the production areas going upriver, or salt or sugar that's going in. Those are all additive to the system, but the volumes are still included. And so when you start looking at this, it not only provides the building blocks of our society, whether it's cement or rocks and gravel, but it's also the food, and it's also the fiber, and it's also the fuel. These are very important, what it does for the system. So that's a big ask of this system, that in why what Sean just said, to be able to keep that stretch of the river operational is so important to so many people upriver.
Ken, have you looked at in part of your study, or maybe from your other work that you do, what predominantly are the commodities that are flowing through the channel and contribute to this trade value?
Yeah, when you're looking at that value, it's going to come back to agriculture, and you're looking at the amount of agricultural commodities, whether it's corn, soybeans, even wheat, distiller dry grains with solubles, soybean meal, ethanol, biodiesel coming down the river. And it's a large volume, and roughly 60% of U.S. grain, soybeans, and corn and grain exports move through this stretch of the river. And so that's very important that that has access there. But it's also then the amount of fertilizer that moves up the river that's very important. There's a lot of coal that will come down and goes out through this stretch of the river for exports. And then you're looking at other commodities such as cement and the liquid cargoes as well, the refined products or commodities that are leaving the area and moving upriver. And they become those inputs to production for agriculture or for other industry. So these types of commodities are very important. And when you look at some of these markets that it's going to, I mean, look, one of our largest importing countries is from Russia, followed by Brazil, Venezuela, and Mexico are some of the top countries where goods come from and originate and come into the system. Meanwhile, China, Mexico, Japan, Colombia are some of the largest countries where commodities that leave the United States and leave through this channel are going to. So it's very important from that standpoint. And when you look at these commodities, there's a great relationship that is served from the barge market, bringing commodities down, interfacing with and transloading onto deep ocean vessels and going out of the country. And it's in many cases, very strong, almost one-to-one relationship that we see take place there.
So how did you deal with there's been some trade disruptions, right, with all of the tariffs. How did you factor that in, or did you not factor that into this study? How did you approach that?
Yeah, well, quite frankly, because the data is so old by the time we get it, and it's official from the U.S. government. So we were really through 2023 or 2022 and some of the current data, and even then we had some 2023. But in reality, the tariff is an impact. But at the end of the day, we know that the United States has valuable resources that people need as building blocks or feed a stock for their economy. And the same thing for the United States. And so nonetheless, that's still important. And whatever the tariffs are here on this stretch of the river is true for any other port or waterway in the United States. So in many respects, it's kind of a wash. But at the same time, because the number of commodities that move through this waterway system, no other waterway system comes close. And quite frankly, the number of countries that are served through this waterway, they do not come close. And that gives an advantage for this waterway. And that's why it's so important that it remains open and has that access. Whether there's strong tariffs or not, there are still some offsets that get to be important. Steel and some of the other ones, those are important. But even still, if we're not importing the steel, there's steel manufacturing taking place on that stretch of the river or from upriver locations, and you still have that interface that takes place here. And so there's kind of that somewhat of an agnostic view, but there's still an important aspect that tariffs are an important feature. And when those policy shifts change, people are going to make quick changes, but nonetheless, they want to make sure they have a reliable system that even though there could be some challenges, that the system's going to be operational, it's going to function. And certainly Big River Coalition through Sean Duffy have made sure that that message is clear and that it does remain open.
So Sean, you mentioned a little bit on the economic risks that come from disruptions. Give us a little more on that. What are those disruptions, and is the current infrastructure where it needs to be, or are there some things we should be doing to improve that infrastructure?
Okay, well, I would say yes, there's a lot of things. We need to be working on our infrastructure. The biggest challenge that we see is related to climate variability. That's climate change with the notion that you understand it. Climate variability, we've seen in this last decade, multiple opens of the Bonnet Carré spillway and back-to-back. So 2016, 2018, twice in 2019, 2020. That average over the long-term history of the Bonnet Carré spillway was once a decade. So for it to happen multiple times in a 5-year period, and then since then, we've had the most low water drought conditions where the construction of the saltwater sill has been required. Saltwater is a threat that I see impacting coastal regions. Relative sea level rise here, and relative is added because we have subsidence going on. As typical with the Big River, any challenge that's being seen in other places is magnified here and more critical. Trying to shore up areas where we're losing flow in the river. What happens during a high river, if you were to think of the Mississippi River as a garden hose, we're losing a lot of flow below New Orleans. And in High River, where we have these breaks in the garden hose, High River, those holes get bigger, which means we incur more shoaling in new areas and we're during low water, of course, salt water flows inward. So the infrastructure, and one of my challenges is we have ports looking to have more resilient infrastructure, but we need to make sure the waterway is resilient also. And these concerns we've talked about in many places, we continue to raise them. There's some science studying what they call crevasses where these holes are, but the end of the day, these crevasses are truthfully an Achilles heel. If we do not shore them up, more important, if anything's more important than navigation on the river, that's our drinking water source. Fresh water impacts all life, and as we work on some of these, maintaining the channel becomes trickier because we don't have as much flow in the river. 150 years ago, when James Buchanan Eads opened up South Pass, the way he did it is he kept flow in the river. He closed off a major distributary and he put in willow mats so that flow of the river, the force of the river itself, scoured out the channel. The hydrology hasn't changed our focus on it. It seems we've forgotten what we knew 150 years ago, but some of those challenges are real. One of the ways we've been able to help combat that is with the beneficial use of dredge material. In 15 years, we've restored with the Corps and pilots and state and federal agencies an area equivalent to Washington, D.C., 15,000 acres of beneficial use land from dredge material. That's something that we need to try to expand where we have these breaks in the river. If we do not shore them up, we will not be able to maintain our drinking water supply. I've seen the mayor of New York City saying we may not be able to continue to get drinking water out of the Hudson River. It's for the same reason. And in Corpus Christi, they have been looking at trying to fund a desalination plant that had a price tag of like $1.3 billion. We're not talking about desalination on the river yet, but I think we should be. Drinking water is more important.
Anything to add to that, Ken?
Yeah, with one of the things that Sean was highlighting was just to be able to keep it open and to be able to deal with some of these issues, because when there's impediments in the system, that just leads to higher freight rates, and higher freight rates, especially for farmers, they end up getting weakened bases as a result, and then competition gets distributed elsewhere. Either the grain goes to another market in the United States, or competition overseas picks up the volume from the United States. And look, when there's a draft restriction that limits the amount that the vessel can be in the water, you just can't load as much cargo on there. And for every 1 foot draft restriction, you're looking at about almost a 2% rate increase on the ocean freight rate. And then let's just say that's just under $1 per metric ton. Well, if you have a closure of the river system, just say for 1 day, that's just about 1% increase in the ocean freight rate. But really, it starts to get a bit more, accelerates the longer it goes on, or the more it happens, because people think that the river's not functioning as the way it should, or as promised, or they hear this kind of the seeds of doubt, as Sean has highlighted, that maybe it's not going to be a reliable system. And so those costs get to be more pervasive in their response. But beyond that, then you start looking at what happens locally, and working with a couple other groups. Action Intel worked really closely on some of the trade relationship data with the barge data, but also with Decision Innovation Solutions and looking at the economic impact. And when you have a closure of the system, there's an impact to the local system local communities. And while there's a global impact, a national impact, there's really a big impact locally where you have lost output. There's not as much income for the value add for taxes, but then there's also a labor component that if the river's closed or you can't load as much because competition goes elsewhere, the ship goes to another market, there's going to be a negative impact. And we see, from an output standpoint, for a 2-week closure, you could be looking almost $200 million, $1 billion in that regard. And the same thing with a draft restriction that you could be upwards of several millions of dollars. But what happens with those are a bit more local. And in the river system, because it's got that, thousands of miles upriver, the inertia of it keeps moving. And by the time it gets down to the rivers, 2-3 weeks later, boy, they've got to make some adjustments in that system. And by then it's almost too late to do something. And then those signals get delayed further on. And so this system almost, it takes a while to get those communications and to be able to have reliability and resilience. Those are two important words there. And that's something that Big River, I know, works really hard to do and working with the industry. But without that, you're going to have some negative impacts on this system here every year if we don't take care of the system, and we just become less competitive in the world market then.
Sean, any final key takeaways, final thoughts you'd like to leave our audience with here today?
Just real quickly, yes, I'll follow up. And because this data goes back to 2022, as we weren't able to really capture the impact of the tariffs, we also weren't able to capture the economic impact of some important industries that didn't exist here in 2022. The one that comes to mind first is LNG. We have Venture Global moving about a vessel and a half a day right now. Each one of those vessels has between approximately 50 million to 250 million worth of LNG products on board when they move. And they're gearing up to do 2 vessels a day as they continue to expand. So that's been a real game changer. That economics isn't captured. And then the other one, and it's definitely to a lesser degree, but still very important, is the expansion of the river cruise industry. River cruises adding tourism dollars in locations that might not normally have that many visitors, and it's really expanded over about that same period of time. So I do envision we'd be doing a volume 2 or 3 down the road as this one gets absorbed, but river economics is there. Having good information, we're going to put that to good use as we go to Washington to continue to try to make sure that we're maximizing efficiencies on the ship channel and above.
Ken, what about from you? Any final thoughts or key takeaways you'd like to leave with us today?
Yeah, this is an economic powerhouse, this stretch of the river. It's second to no one in the United States. It's the America's commodity waterway, handling a wide diversity of commodities. If there's an impediment in the system, it has its impacts all the way upstream into the hinterland of the United States. The agricultural community knows the value of this. Farmers, not even just those on the river, but those far from the river. There's a good friend, Mike Lefevre, up in Colorado. He has said, look, when the river is being impacted, I feel it in Colorado. And that reverberates with that weakened basis throughout the system there. And those challenges are very real. Being able to have an infrastructure system that can serve the world is important. And to be able to work together with the partners to collaborate, there's nothing better than what this study can do to help bring people together and to be able to tell the story with factual information that trade is important, that domestic movements of commodities are important, and that they connect well on this Mississippi River Ship Channel. We've got still great opportunities. We still got challenges. The exports for U.S. agricultural commodities are under challenge because of tariffs and other things. But we're also seeing that we got record corn exports this year. And that's going to be important that we have the reliable outlets for the grain to move and for the farmers to have that assurity that what they grow can get to the markets that need it.
Very good. Yeah, trade is always important. Our thanks to you, Ken, and to you, Sean, for joining us here today. We appreciate all of the insight you've shared, and hope folks go and check out your report.
Thank you, Sarah.
Likewise, we want to thank all of you in our audience for tuning in today. We appreciate you being with us. Until next time, for Feedstuffs, I'm Sarah Muirhead.